All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Eduardo Soto. I'm a director at the Raben Group, and I am so excited to be hosting this virtual panel for our Policy Pulse series at the firm today. We will be focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on an especially vulnerable population, which are the workers employed in the gig economy. And gig workers have been in the headlines quite a bit lately. The pandemic has revealed a series of vulnerabilities experienced by workers employed in these sectors. And it rose to national prominence in our debate about how the federal government should respond to this pandemic when the Congress on a bipartisan basis decided that despite their independent contractor status, gig workers should absolutely be eligible for compensation under unemployment insurance funds and unemployment benefits across the country. So I'm excited to kick this off. I'm going to be introducing Congresswoman Susan Wild of the 7th District of Pennsylvania, a member of Congress who has been particularly focused on this specific issue and on labor issues in general. And we're eager to learn from her about what Congress ought to be doing, what we have gotten right, and what has been lacking in our response so far in making sure that everybody, absolutely everybody, is getting the support that they need throughout this pandemic. Congresswoman Wild is serving her first term, elected to represent the Lehigh Valley area in Allentown in the state of Pennsylvania. The Congresswoman serves on education and labor and received the endorsements during her race to run for the seat of the Teamsters, the SEIU, teachers unions, and various other major labor organizations who have, in one way or another, also tried to shed light on the importance of providing a lifeline and a minimum amount of safeguards for workers employed under these conditions as independent contractors. So Congresswoman, with that, I would like to introduce you. I would like to turn over the mic to you. And I know that we'll be hearing about a very successful letter writing effort where you worked with Congressman Tony Cardenas to encourage the Department of Labor at the federal level to clarify their guidelines so that gig workers everywhere could access the benefits that Congress authorized for them to receive. And my understanding is you didn't even ever have to hit send on that letter. Thank you for joining us, Congresswoman. Tell us a little bit about that and all the work you've been doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be with all of you today. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to be together, even though we are apart in these very strange and unprecedented times. It has become a broken record almost to say that the times are unprecedented, but they truly are. And I hope you and your loved ones and everyone in your circle of friends is safe and healthy and will remain so for the duration of this pandemic. Over the past few months, we've been working at all hours to figure out the solutions that will sustain our small businesses through the rest of the shutdown, make sure our working families are getting paid so that they can pay their bills, and enable our incredible healthcare workers and frontline workers to keep doing their jobs and be safe. At this point, Congress has passed 4 bipartisan packages to support the American people. The third package, the CARES Act, provided expanded eligibility to provide unemployment compensation to workers who are not normally eligible for benefits. That includes small business owners, independent contractors, and gig workers like a lot of you are. This was one of my top priorities, and I was proud that this provision was included. One of the things that I've been very, very focused on during my time in Congress as a member of the Education and Labor Committee is to make sure that we are giving adequate protections of every form to the people who are independent contractors and gig workers and not working in conventional employment situations. So having this included in the CARES Act was absolutely essential to me, and I was so pleased when it passed. Under the CARES Act, independent contractors and gig workers can apply for new temporary federal benefits And the CARES Act also recognized that if employers scale back an employee's hours, the employee is still going to be in need of financial assistance, even though they may not technically have lost their job. So after this historic legislation was passed, and it was truly historic, the U.S. Department of Labor issued a brand new rule that a gig worker must be, and this is a quote, forced to suspend operations, end quote, to qualify for unemployment compensation, meaning that they would not be able to work at all in order to qualify. This standard made it nearly impossible for gig workers like rideshare and food delivery drivers and many others to obtain benefits to cover losses that were the result of reduced demand for their business, regardless of whether their apps were still operating. I believed firmly that this rule was directly contrary to the spirit and intent of the CARES Act, which broadly and temporarily had opened unemployment compensation to these independent contractors, gig workers, and sole proprietors based on their recent earnings without regard to whether their operations had been suspended entirely. So for that reason, in late April, I, along with Congressman Cardenas, led an effort expressing our alarm and disappointment with the Department of Labor's guidance regarding unemployment benefits in the CARES Act. Then, shortly after, and after this letter was prepared and ready to go, the Department of Labor reversed course and issued new guidance that permitted gig workers to obtain unemployment compensation for reduced business prospects rather than requiring them to suspend work altogether. That, of course, is a perfect example of why it is so essential that we maintain congressional oversight throughout this crisis, so that no worker and no family gets left behind, and so that the administration is not able to subvert the intent and purpose of the legislation that we pass. Moving forward, my priority is going to continue to be to support our local municipalities, our hospitals, our healthcare workers, our first responders, nonprofits, small businesses, college students, educational institutions, the Postal Service, and workers to ensure that everybody is able to safely and securely weather this health crisis. And I also believe that we must have oversight of where future funding is going, and that we need to ensure that said funding is accessible for the folks truly in the most need. So with that, I am very happy to participate in this panel. Thank you for having me, and I am looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. It's I think, extremely important for us to remember that sometimes Congress can legislate something, but without the appropriate implementation, which is the phase that we're in for most of these major pieces of legislation adopted recently. We're in the implementation phase. It's important to conduct oversight. Thank you so much for that. And we actually have the privilege today of hearing directly from Edan Alva, who is a worker leader and rideshare driver with Gig Workers Rising. He is in California, which has been a ground zero of sorts for this debate around what kind of benefits should be afforded to gig workers like rideshare drivers, not just during the pandemic, but every time of year and under any circumstances. So Edan, I'm hoping that you can share with us, thank you so much for joining today. I'm hoping you can share with us some of the challenges that gig workers have experienced since this pandemic started, and how that's shaped your understanding of the reforms that we need and the support that we need to provide to gig workers.
Pleasure to be here, Eduardo. The broader perspective of the COVID crisis, as far as I can see it, demonstrates the way that companies, like that the gig companies, have always conducted their business. I mean, it simply applied to a new crisis that exposes all the difficulties in the way that they work. The model of business of gig companies is to push all the risk and costs onto their workforce, then the government, then the public, the taxpayers, while pocketing all the revenue and profiting all they can. During the coronavirus crisis, drivers were not provided with minimal protections. Instead, they were sent out to continue working with no sick days, no protective gear, no access to health insurance. They cope with high expense work, gas maintenance, various technical failures, etc., that happen a lot when you drive a lot. And they end up with less than minimum wage when you deduct those expenses, which at best, if everything goes well, barely allows them to exist. So they have no ability to save and to cope with any mishaps in their lives. And in my case, I felt the whole situation similar to the coronavirus situation actually before the coronavirus started. In January, I got sick with what I believe was regular flu. I continued to work after developing the symptoms simply because I couldn't afford to stop working and pay my rent. I mean, I had the option of working while I'm sick, putting myself and my passengers at risk, or stopping to work and losing the roof over my head. And I know many drivers who do lose the roof over their head because of similar situations. So really, I had no alternative. When I finally got too sick to work at all, I stayed at home for a week, but still couldn't go to the doctor because I couldn't afford a doctor with my income. I do have health insurance that I pay for, but I have to take like the cheapest health insurance out there. And my deductible is so high that I need to pay beyond my ability just to see to go for a single visit to a doctor. When the coronavirus started, I realized that because of the nature of my work as a driver, I'm in a precarious situation in terms of exposure to risk for myself, for my family, and my passengers, for that matter. And I found myself scrambling to find things like disinfecting materials for my car, for my personal protection and personal protection gears, gloves and masks and such. I went to the Lyft hub twice before it completely shut down, only to be told that Lyft doesn't support drivers in getting any of these items. I ended up spending hours going from store to store until I found limited cleaning supplies. Never got personal protection gear, just couldn't find it anywhere. Then found myself spending much of my work day disinfecting my car between rides, all at my expense. And as I said, we already barely exist with the income of this work. Exposing workers to risk with no protection and keeping them in poverty to guarantee that they continue to work is just immoral, illegal, unacceptable in any modern society. Yet this is the way these companies work. They misclassify their workers so that they don't owe them anything, quote unquote, and they do not comply with the law, which leaves drivers like me without access to unemployment when we are unable to work, when we are at our most vulnerable situation. They pocket all the profits. They take advantage of everyone, from workers to government to taxpayers. It horrifies me that companies like Uber, Lyft, and other gig companies spend tens of millions of dollars on lobbying and attempting to repeal legislation that protects workers, that they outright lie and misrepresent themselves in order to misclassify drivers as independent contractors. The coronavirus crisis reinforced in my mind how critical it is for us workers to come together to fight for our rights. I don't want my son to grow up in a society where workers' lives are less important than corporate profits. I just don't. I strongly believe that the only way to fix this really dystopian situation that we're in is for workers to organize, to unionize, and to fight as a collective against predatory corporations.
Thank you, Edan. And of course, you were referencing there at the end the landmark legislation adopted in California, AB 5, to curb misclassification and ensure a minimum amount of benefits are afforded and rights are afforded to workers in the gig economy. Thank you so much. For those tuning in, Edan, who we are so pleased could join us today, moved to the United States from Israel 19 years ago. He lives in Alameda, California with his son, whom he supports as a rideshare driver. And about 2 years ago, he got involved with the fight on behalf of gig workers by becoming a leader with Gig Workers Rising. Thank you, Edan. I look forward to talking to you throughout today's panel. We're going to turn now to Michelle Miller, who is a co-founder of coworker.org, and who can pick up exactly what Edan left off in terms of how the labor practices that we're seeing in terms of misclassification, in terms of the denial of basic labor rights because of misclassification has contributed to more of a systemic erosion in other sectors as well, such that it's not just gig workers who are being denied protective gear or who are working in unsafe conditions these days. It's also employees who ought to otherwise be able to challenge those standards. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about what work you've been doing and what you're seeing, not just in the gig economy, but elsewhere.
Sure. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And also thank you, Representative Wild and Edan, for sharing your remarks and for the work to support workers in the gig economy. So yeah, coworker.org is a platform that supports organizing by people who generally are unaffiliated with labor unions or institutions to basically have easy, immediate access to organizing infrastructure, to build solidarity networks inside their companies, and to shift power around policies. And when the coronavirus hit, we saw over 250 campaigns in less than a month started by workers in all sectors of the economy. So these were people in food service and logistics and gig and grocery, construction, hospitals, etc. All who had an immediate sense of what the pandemic could mean for them as far as both health and safety and being appropriately compensated for the risk they were going to be asked to take. We saw waves of patterns around campaigns that were launched on the site. There were a number initially of paid leave campaigns in grocery stores and in retail locations. And some of those early employers said that they would give people increased access to paid time off. We saw workers, especially in the grocery sector, win hazard pay and really set us a minimum in that sector of hazard pay for people who are working on the front lines. So through Coworker, people at HEB, Texas-based grocery chain, and workers at Market of Choice in Oregon won hazard pay. Workers at national chains like Kroger and Safeway, who are members of UFCW, also won minimums around hazard pay. And what we also saw, which was really interesting and inspiring, were workers who were challenging the assertion of their employers that the businesses they were working at were essential businesses. So, for example, Staples employees, which is an office supply chain, have been challenging the idea that they should remain open during the pandemic. And Starbucks baristas, who have actually been organizing on coworker.org for 6 years, were very quickly, in the moment that the pandemic hit, able to organize so that stores, cafes would be closed for a month with pay. And what those workers are doing now is joining together to ensure that when the stores reopen, that they are able to assure the maximum amount of protection for both the people behind the cash register and for customers, and ensuring, again, that the pay that they receive for the risk that they are taking is appropriate. What we are also seeing, though, are the ways in which the policies and the spirit of the policies and the implementation of the policies are not actually being met as folks may have imagined. And so one example is the access to paid time off. What we have learned from workers over the past month is that even in places where paid time off was made, was expanded to cover all workers, the fine print basically said that in order to access paid time off, you had to test positive for coronavirus. And so workers in the early phases of the pandemic who had also been told that if they felt any sense of sickness, they should not come in, took responsibility for their community and their coworkers, chose not to come in. If they could get a test, potentially, if they tested negative, the access to paid time off was revoked. And so there are a number of workers who are missing paychecks, who are working on the front lines in places like grocery stores and delivery and logistics, who are also not actually being met with the promised paid time off that they had been assured because of loopholes in those policies that actually make them much harder to access than they had imagined. What we're seeing among workers, again, mostly at grocery chains, there's a huge campaign by workers at Publix grocery chain, which is a southern grocery store. They still have not won hazard pay. Some workers in places like deli and the meat section are reporting that they are not permitted to wear masks, and that they are grappling with the process of reopening places in states where governors are considering reopening, and really having to think through how their organizing is, again, going to continue to protect them and the people who are coming into stores. And so, what we're seeing in terms of campaigns that are growing on the site right now are demands around mask wearing and PPE. We have a campaign by Shipt Shoppers. Shipt is the gig economy company that does deliveries for Target, and Luggers, who is a gig economy company that provides moving services, both asking for basic access to PPE, to masks, and to hand sanitizer, in addition to the ability to choose whether or not to work without facing punishment. So many of these demands that workers are making are really basic. They are just about keeping the people in their families and in their communities safe. And again, ensuring that they are appropriately compensated for the risk that they are taking on behalf of all of us. They are truly the people who are keeping the economy running. And I believe that through the organizing that they've done over the past month and a half, and through the networks that they've been able to build, they are going to be the people who help us ensure that the standards that we are setting through federal legislation, like what Representative Wild has pushed, and state and local legislation, they are going to be the ones who are going to tell us whether or not those aspirations are actually being met in the front lines and in the workplace.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Such terrific work going on at coworker.org across the country, helping workers make their workplaces a little bit safer, asking just for the minimum amount of equipment and protective gear. Thank you for everything that you're doing. I would actually like to bring everybody back on for a panel discussion at this time. And I want to kick things off with a very basic question, and perhaps Michelle and Congresswoman Wild could help us all understand. And that is, how did we get to this point? We saw the House pass the Protecting the Right to Organize Act recently, for example. There have been attempts to revise and to update our federal labor laws to make sure that we keep up with technological advances and that we account for everybody's needs. But is this more a matter of lax enforcement that has allowed for this degree of misclassification, for example, and treatment as contractors for what should otherwise be considered employees?
Well, I'm just going to say, and I hope I can be heard here, that I think it's a combination of lax enforcement, but also that the times have changed and that legislation has not kept up with the times. The days of working 9 to 5, 5 days a week, never working on weekends, have long since come and gone. We're seeing it in all sectors of the economy. We see people working much longer hours than they used to. The 40-hour work week is almost a myth these days. And so that has evolved considerably over decades of time. And I think that we frankly have not kept up with it through various twists and turns of our political cycles. I think that this most recent in 2018 shift in the House of Representatives really made a difference in terms of electing a lot of people who were very, very labor oriented. And I'm not necessarily referring to organized labor right now in that comment, but let's say worker oriented. And a lot of that is because we come from such varied backgrounds. There are not a lot of people in the freshman class, which was very large, who come from your classic political backgrounds. And so I think a lot of us brought to the table things that really matter in terms of the rights of working people. And we made those a priority. And of course, having a majority in the House enabled us to pass the PRO Act and otherwise. So I think it's a combination of being some lax enforcement, but also a failure to keep up with the times and how workers and the definition of work has changed.
So much. Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that the Congresswoman has laid out, and I would say that that in addition to lax enforcement, we have seen, as collective bargaining power and labor power has declined, we've seen kind of an equal and opposite push for the power of businesses to erode people's access to collective power in their workplaces. So when you see 30 to 40 years of increasing outsourcing and fragmentation, and as David Weil calls it, the fissuring of the economy, every moment of that fissure pulls more people out of the definition of employee and the ability to access the rights that are codified in the National Labor Relations Act in order to organize. And what is remarkable, I think, I love, really broadening the definition to like folks coming from a variety of labor backgrounds, even beyond institutional trade unions, is that there's actually so much activity happening among workers of many different classes, organizing and collectively advocating for their needs right now, that what my hope is that we start to imagine a future labor infrastructure that is built based on what they are demanding and is responsive to all of the different ways in which people need and want to organize, so that we can, over the long term, keep up with changes in the economy.
Thank you. Edan, you've been an organizer in this area for 2 years. Based on what you're hearing from Congresswoman Wild and from Michelle, how do you think that would line up with your experience and what you've heard from gig workers in your organizing efforts? Would you say that gig workers generally regard themselves as employees who have been misclassified?
I would say that the different workers perceive themselves in different ways. Most of the people I work with definitely perceive themselves as misclassified. From what I've seen, even the people who don't perceive themselves necessarily as employees are doing it from reasons that are sort of not necessarily relevant to the status of employee or contractor. For example, Lyft and Uber came out with this massive misinformation campaign where they claim that if someone is an employee, by definition, they'll have to work shifts, they'll have to work 9 to 5, like particular time schedules. They did that because they know that for drivers and other gig workers, the flexibility is a huge thing. Maybe those gig workers are taking care of somebody sick at home, or maybe they have school or whatever it is in their life that requires that flexibility that gig work provides. There is no legal requirement in any way, shape, or form that an employee would be not flexible. Essentially, what these gig companies are saying is, so far, we sort of, quote unquote, screwed you over with the whole aspect of low pay, no benefits, and all that. If you force us to treat you fairly on that end, we will find a whole new way to screw you over. That is sort of a hidden threat, but they present it as though it's sort of the limitation of the fact that people are considered employees, which has nothing to do with it. Most drivers are not aware of it because those companies are pushing it through their app out there to every driver, and then we as organizers are having this uphill battle where we have to try to provide accurate information to all those people and get them to understand that their status has nothing to do with their flexibility. So yeah, I mean, what was mentioned earlier is very accurate. The labor market changed. People that I know, many of them work 2, 3, 4 different jobs in order to provide. At that point, flexibility is almost irrelevant because you're working most of your day to just make ends meet. And in terms of the impact on workers, they have to do everything they can to simply exist, and without any savings and without any ability to support themselves for the future, to save something for pension. All these need to be changed. Workers need to be in a situation where no matter where it is that you work, if you work half a second for a gig company, if you work an hour, if you work a day, if you work 5 seconds here and 10 hours there, where somewhere your rights are being kept and you have all the benefits and protection that a worker person deserves.
Thank you, Edan. And I'm actually curious. Have you seen any positive effect as a result of adoption of AB5 in California, or has there been an issue with implementing that law and having these employers abide by it?
For the most part, the gig companies are highly resistant. However, the legislation put them in a challenge where they had to start rethinking the way that they treat drivers. And you can see across those apps suddenly kind of little tweaks and changes that go into the direction where they would try to claim that somehow drivers are independent workers. So for example, up until recently, when I was taking a ride, when I was deciding to pick up a ride, I had no ability of knowing where I'm going, how long it would take, nothing. I mean, I would take a ride blindly and I didn't know if it would take an hour or 5 minutes or I have to, I mean, and before I accepted it, I wasn't able to see how far it is from me. So often I would need to drive technically 12 miles to pick up somebody for half a block or something like that. They started changing those little things, but the broader picture is that they're still grossly taking advantage of their workers. And I'm happy to say that I was just informed that the Attorney General of California has submitted a lawsuit against Uber and Lyft in trying to enforce, as part of enforcing AB5 on the legislation that defines us as employees rather than contractors.
We are a very, very fortunate panel today in that we have such exciting breaking news to discuss. This lawsuit from California Attorney General Javier Becerra against Uber and Lyft for failing to comply with AB5 has the potential to elevate this issue to the national arena even further. And there's also a second aspect to compliance with AB5 and to this question of misclassification, and it's lately we're hearing a lot about unemployment insurance. A major part of the CARES Act, for example, that Congresswoman Wild was describing earlier, provided funds to ensure that gig workers, as well as anybody experiencing job loss or reduced hours as a result of the pandemic, could receive unemployment insurance for an extended period. And that kind of relief is critical. However, in the context of this debate, I would like to ask the Congresswoman and Michelle about unemployment insurance funds and how gig economy workers have not been contributing to them as a result of their treatment of their workers as independent contractors. So I'm curious, Congresswoman, we'll start with you. Do you think that these employers and the companies' reluctance or resistance to contributing to these funds has actually exacerbated budgetary issues at the state and local level? What kind of pressure do you think these funds are under?
Well, yes, it certainly has. And it's one of the reasons that we need to make sure that we get additional assistance for our states and municipalities as we move forward with additional, additional packet funding under the CARES Act or whatever the next round of packages will be called. Under the CARES Act, states are fully reimbursed by the federal government for the cost of benefits and administration. And that includes for the independent contractors and gig workers who are now able to apply for the temporary new federal benefits at their state unemployment compensation office. And we know that the amount of unemployment that they receive depends on their earnings and their individual state benefit formulas. But one of the things that we came to realize was that the federal government was not releasing a great deal of the money that we had allocated for the administration under these unemployment compensation programs. And so we've actually had to press for additional funding or actually to implement the funding. Once again, getting back to the issue of oversight that was appropriated by us for this very purpose.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Michelle, we just had a thread up about this issue from Assemblywoman Gonzalez out of the California legislature, complaining about exactly this fact. So I would love your thoughts on whether states were even prepared to provide this type of assistance, and what these employers should be held responsible for during this crisis.
Yeah, I can speak specifically to New York State, where I live, and where the New York Taxi Workers Alliance is partnering with us on a campaign related to access to unemployment benefits by gig economy drivers, and specifically Uber drivers. In New York State, in 2018, gig economy drivers were determined to be employees for the specific purpose of collecting unemployment benefits. And Uber has not paid into that at all. It's hundreds of millions of dollars in lack of payment that puts a huge strain on the state unemployment system. And just to really nail the details of how this avoidance has happened, they also refuse to, when a driver wants to claim unemployment, they refuse to release the data that proves hours worked to the state unemployment agency. And so what the driver has to do is use a fax machine, like a literal fax machine, to fax their information to the state unemployment office in order to access benefits, which is just multiple layers of avoiding someone being able to access something they have every right to as a worker in New York State. And the Taxi Workers Alliance is working really hard on overturning that. And I also just want to say quickly that we have heard from so many workers across the country about their troubles generally accessing unemployment benefits, and accessing unemployment agencies, which is a direct result, I think, of underfunding. I'm sure that the people that work in those agencies don't want to be inaccessible and want to be able to deliver benefits, but are unable to do so. And we are also hearing from workers now that some are being nudged by their employers to suggest that they've worked a couple more hours than they have in order to meet the threshold that prevents them from being able to collect unemployment benefits for underemployment. So there's just a series of things that are happening right now that workers are noticing, and that I think workers are going to start to organize around as unemployed people, and unemployed councils or unemployed worker organizing to ensure that the system meets the demands that it should be set up to meet.
And if I can just add in here that you've heard undoubtedly a lot of discussion from the administration, specifically from the president, about a payroll tax cut, which of course, if allowed to go forward with that, would further encumber the states and municipalities and hinder their ability to pay out unemployment compensation. So this, it's being touted as a method of helping small businesses. The reality is that a payroll tax cut hurts workers.
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's actually a great segue to my next question, which is, seeing all these issues with implementation and the delay in setting up oversight structures for the CARES Act and other COVID-19 related legislation. What do you think are alternatives to that kind of payroll tax cut and other proposals that we're hearing? What do you think absolutely needs to be addressed in a phase 4 bill, as they're referring to it in this context of supporting gig workers?
Well, first, and we haven't really touched on safety all that much. Edan did mention his lack of PPE and so forth, but I think it's essential that whatever we have in the future includes strong safety protections for all workers. I would also suggest, as a general proposition, that we need to start classifying all individuals who work for the benefit of another person. In other words, or entity, that any person or entity that derives income from the labors of somebody else, that the people who work for them be classified as workers. We get into this, this classification system of employee, independent contractor, gig, and so forth. But when you get right down to the heart of it, workers work to earn money to support themselves and their families, and they work for someone else or an entity that in turn makes money off of their efforts. And so I think we need to get to a much more generalized definition of worker. Unless one is truly self-employed, working only for himself or herself, they are working for someone else. And I think that's something that's really important for us to do. When we get a moment, and I don't want to go off course too much, but I would like to talk a little bit more about the safety protections that I think are so incredibly important for all workers.
Well, let's do that right now. I would actually like to kick off that discussion by asking Edan about the announcement from Uber Technologies Inc. that they will be requiring their drivers to wear a face mask or to cover their faces while driving for Uber, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. And Edan, I'm very curious, since you mentioned PPE lately, is this enough, and what's a reasonable next step to take?
First of all, I should qualify the fact that my personal experience comes from Lyft, not from Uber. I have less information about Uber, but generally speaking, I would be greatly surprised if with that announcement, they also decide to provide that protective gear, which means that once again, the expectation is on drivers to find solutions, much like before that, Lyft requested the drivers to disinfect their cars. Okay, thank you for the advice, but that's another burden on workers where the company just keeps reaping the profits. I didn't see any even symbolic increase in rates during this period, at least to
So, Congresswoman, I'm going to ask our producer Elizabeth to put up the question from Brian Smith about safety in the times of COVID-19. I'd like for you to pick up that discussion.
Okay. And I assume everybody can see the question that's being asked.
That's true. Yes.
Okay. So one of my greatest concerns is that the Department of Labor has always, not always, but certainly now stands at odds with the original Organic Act of 1913 that established the Department of Labor in the first place, and which expressly stated that the department's purpose would be to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of working people, to improve their working conditions, and to enhance their opportunities for profitable employment. That goes back to 1913. And of course, we all know that there is a real movement afoot to try to abolish these agencies in their entirety. I would propose that the Department of Labor has never been so necessary and so needed in its original form for the purpose for which it was developed. So my focus, and that of many of my colleagues who are on the Education and Labor Committee, is to make sure that we carry out the express purpose of the Department of Labor to protect workers like all of you. And that's why, along with many of my colleagues on the Education and Labor Committee, we introduced a bill to require new OSHA standards that are specific to COVID-19, standards that are actually enforceable. The DOL, the Department of Labor, suggests that employers should just follow CDC guidance. Well, I think that's insufficient. First of all, that guidance, as we have seen, changes on a very regular basis. In the beginning, people weren't being advised to wear masks, and now people are being advised to wear masks, and it makes it very difficult to follow. And then there's the issue of securing the materials that you need, as Edan has spoken to. So we have to be able to deter the actors that don't social distance, that don't offer the protective masks and face shields where appropriate, that don't have hand sanitizing materials or stations on hand, that don't enforce the rules about employees being a certain number of feet apart. We've seen horrible, desperate situations coming out of meat packing plants and the unsafe conditions that they have been subjected to. So part of my efforts as I fight for a fairer labor system is going to be to continue to keep addressing the issue of independent contractors and gig workers, particularly with regard to workplace safety, because as you so eloquently noted, Edan, you can use PPE as long as you can procure it and pay for it. But the company that benefits from your efforts, and that may be something that actually keeps your riders feeling safer and therefore more likely to use Lyft as a service, which of course inures to the benefit of Lyft, to you also, but very much to the benefit of Lyft. And yet they leave you to find your own PPE and to pay for your own PPE without even giving you any difference in your rate or in your percentage that you're able to keep. I know that all of you face an uphill battle enforcing workplace safety standards, and that's why I think it's so incredibly important that we enact this new OSHA rule, and that our committee moves forward with making sure that Protections are in place that are specifically geared to COVID-19. And then, of course, beyond COVID-19, hopefully there will be a beyond COVID-19 time, that we make sure that OSHA protections are fully enforceable at all times. And that's what I think you've all been on the front lines and unfairly forgotten. I often comment that people who are on the front lines are taken so much for granted until they're needed. Once they're needed, it's not taken for granted unless, of course, for some reason that frontline worker is no longer available, and then we all notice and wake up. But I'm used to using rideshare services myself whenever I'm in Washington. If one day all of a sudden they all disappeared and I wasn't able to use the rideshare service, I would realize, the benefit that they conferred on me as a user, as well as on their company. So I see all of you risking getting COVID-19 as you transport people around our communities and deliver food and groceries. And for all of us, for everybody here in this country, you are worth protecting. And I will continue my mission to make sure that we do that.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And of course, a lot of the issues that you stressed are issues that Edan is experiencing every day, and the workers that he organizes are experiencing every day. And Michelle, if you care to elaborate, I understand you have a few active ongoing campaigns regarding workplace safety. And it would appear, based on the Congresswoman's remarks, that perhaps employers should embrace these calls for safety standards, because the alternative, as we've seen in some examples, the alternative has been to just close up shop for the safety of the employees. So how do you see that debate between keeping businesses open but trying to apply strict safety standards versus needing to close instead?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things going on here. And we are seeing a number of campaigns that are focused on worker health and safety, specifically access to PPE. We have been supporting a postal workers campaign that has about 80,000 people who've joined, so that postal workers can have access to basic protective equipment while they're doing their rounds, which I would add that if we are going to have an election in November that is done by mail, we really do need to think about those postal workers as frontline workers for the election, and adequately support them. Yeah. And what we're also seeing are, as states are reopening, many workers, as I kind of mentioned before, really thinking about health and safety is also practiced by social distancing, access to masks, as Edan and the Congresswoman talked about, being something that the employer or the platform is providing directly to people. And I would even say that access to paid time off should be considered a piece of the health and safety work. And that what we're seeing employers do is implement technology like those cameras that measure your body temperature and just tell you whether or not you can come into work as a safety measure, which are invasive and which will not go away after the crisis. Those will stay as this sort of surveillance apparatus. And the actual way to ensure that we are keeping everyone safe and keeping everyone healthy is just to listen to workers when they say, I am sick and I cannot come to work. And it shouldn't matter whether you can get a doctor's note, and it shouldn't matter whether or not you pass the temperature test at the front door of the store, and it shouldn't matter whether or not you have COVID or you actually just have the flu. You should be able to tell your employer, it is not safe for me to come into this workplace. I am going to stay home and I am going to take care of myself, and just be believed and also provided with what you need to keep that workplace safe for everyone else. And so I think that what we're going to see over the next year are a number of ways to try and address this problem that by employers that are about getting around that kind of basic and fundamental right to say, I'm too sick to work, and that improving the way that OSHA is able to respond and to submit guidelines and to govern what workplace safety is in the context of COVID-19 is going to be an important aspect of workers' ability to push back against those lowering of standards.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I actually want to pivot very briefly because we have some great audience questions queued up that I want to make sure we get to. starting with this question about the unintended consequences of AB5. And I'm very curious what the panel thinks about the need to address the issues experienced by workers employed by the likes of Uber and Lyft, for example, but how in addressing those issues, we can also make sure that people who have made the decision to be independent contractors or freelancers are not unduly harmed by the legislative response. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on how to tailor the approach to avoid those consequences.
Well, I'm not an expert on AB5, but I have heard from many across the country, particularly freelancers, about concerns over the PRO Act and making sure that they are that they're in a position of being able to continue to work without being in a situation of being forced to organize. And it's an issue that's very much on my radar screen, my staff's radar screen, and I anticipate that as we move forward, we're going to need to accommodate that sector of workers to make sure that they aren't inadvertently being shut out of federal legislation, or shut out by federal legislation that was intended to benefit workers and instead has harmed them. But I'd be interested in hearing from somebody with a more of a California perspective, because I know that that's where that originated.
So, from my perspective, having viewed the whole struggle around AB5 in California, well, I will start by saying that AB5 is granted for drivers, gig workers, is a hugely important piece of legislation. Initiated by California Assembly Member Gonzalez, as mentioned earlier. It is essentially a test that defines a clear and simple, and to me it seems a fair way of who can be considered an independent contractor and who is not. The default is that someone is an employee, and you need to go through the specific criteria to meet the specific criteria to be an independent contractor. Makes it much more difficult for companies to classify their workers compared with previous tests that were very elaborate and kind of shifty in a way legally. I understand, I mean, that is a 3-question test that seems logical to me, but I totally understand that there are all sorts of professions and types of work that might fall through the crack. From what I've seen, at least, there's been a massive effort during the past year or so by Assemblymember Gonzalez and many other people behind that legislation to have an input of all those kind of groups and people and professions that might fall through the cracks, might not exactly fit the kind of sharp criteria that this test puts, and try to tweak the legislation accordingly. And to my understanding, are still working on it. Broadly speaking, I would say the legislation is fair, even if it needs to be corrected. I mean, to put it in a different way, if I had a sudden wave of murders in my city, I would first of all make sure that there is a legislation that killing is wrong. Then I would start looking into what circumstances it's okay to kill someone. Same with this situation. There is a massive, I would say, theft of labor being done by corporations, by employers of various kinds. That needs to be stopped. And then we can also look into it, what other circumstances exist where somebody doesn't meet the criteria. I want to point out that AB5 does not cancel the status of contractor, of independent contractor. It just requires a lot more kind of proof that you're actually a contractor, which again, I think is fair. And in the cases where even that is not enough, modifications are being made.
Thank you, Edan. Michelle, I'd like to turn to you in case you have anything to add, but I'm also wondering, could the reverse also be true? Could implementation of laws like AB5 also help raise labor standards across other sectors, do you think?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think Edan is definitely the expert on AB5 here, but what I hear so much and what this speaks to is the fact that we all workers and all kinds of workers need established routes to organize and collectively advocate for what is best for them in their sector. And when, Edan said it better, but like when many different kinds of people with many different kinds of situations have input into the way that we design these laws, then we can ensure that everybody is covered. Everybody who is, as the Congresswoman said, is paid for their labor by another entity has access to the rights and protections like everybody else. So like that sort of feels to me to be the heart of the thing, is that people be able to get together, collectively advocate, to raise standards. And then I do believe that when you have multiple people within an economy and in multiple sectors raising standards, you start to raise the floor for everyone, because you are asserting a new way of supporting folks.
And I'd just like to say that my office always stands ready to work with a group of workers, whether it be freelancers and other independent contractors, on anything at the federal level. So please feel free to reach out to our office in Washington.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think apropos of that, let's pull up a question that we received from Maggie to end our event today. I know that we were going a little bit over, but it's just been a great conversation. Maggie asks, when independent contractors face challenges accessing the unemployment benefits under the CARES Act, for example, what have we seen in your respective experiences, right? That is the most effective way to pressure agencies into getting it right and making sure that we remove those hurdles? Other than calling Congresswoman Wild, which everybody should do if they ever experience difficulties with these.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth, Eduardo, because I was going to say the most effective lobbying that I receive is hearing from people, from real people.
Michelle, Edan?
We do lobbying in all sorts of ways. We talk with legislators, we organize drivers, we push petitions online and offline. We do protests in various ways. We adjust specific types of lobbying to particular circumstances. We work with all levels of government, ranging from city to county to state. Gig Workers Rising is a coalition, or formed a coalition with multiple other labor organizations and entities to come together and push in every way we can all sorts of protections that would lead to better workers' rights. I find that in the bottom line, our power comes from coming together, bringing drivers, bringing workers together, and basically then the system has no choice but to listen to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Michelle, anything to add?
I'll just add that we do have historical examples of people organizing under their identity as unemployed people. And I have a feeling that over the next year, we're going to see, and at Coworker, we're going to experiment with this, is what does it look like for people to come together in a kind of formation that isn't about the shared identity of an employer or a landlord, but is about their status as unemployed people, and what are the demands that emerge from those collections of folks that can be made on the state and can have the long-term effect of really changing the way we think about unemployment in this country, since so much of the unemployment system currently is predicated on a kind of a sense of shame and humiliation about being out of work. Like, how can we actually organize in the immediate moment for people to get the benefits they need, but also reimagine an unemployment system for the future?
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm gonna put on my talk show host voice and say that was Michelle Miller from coworker.org. Edan Alva is with a leader with Gig Workers Rising, and Congresswoman Wild represents the 7th District of Pennsylvania. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining, the audience for engaging in this lively discussion. Thank you for everything that you've taught us today. And more importantly, thank you for all that you've been doing to make sure everybody gets the protection and support they need throughout this pandemic and after. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.